Welcome. Thank you so much for joining in to today's webinar, where we are delighted to have a true friend of Western civilization, of Israel and the United States, of course, Britain, and the Jewish people, Colonel Richard Kemp. Colonel Richard Kemp had led the British Royal Army into Afghanistan. And he has had more than one occasion to look at how various armies conduct themselves in terms of ethical and moral dilemmas around the globe. And he has had courage to speak out in all sorts of forums, not always friendly ones, around the globe, about how he feels the Israeli Defense Forces conduct themselves. He would also like to speak for a bit about the allegations against Israel in the International Criminal Court and about Israel's plans to extend sovereignty over the settlements in Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley. It is really a profound honor, privilege, and pleasure to introduce you to one of our recipients of EMET Speaker of the Truth Award in 2017, Colonel Richard Kemp. I should also say he was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire Military Division on April 25th, 1994, in recognition of his intelligence work in Northern Ireland, and was awarded the Queen's Commendation for Bravery for service as a commander in the United Nations Protection Force in Bosnia in 1994, and he was promoted Commander of the Order of the British Empire Military Division in the New Year Honors 2006. He received an honorary doctorate from Bar-Ilan University in 2015. It's my complete pleasure and honor to introduce you to Colonel Richard Kemp. Richard?
I bet, particularly over in our former colonies, very few people realise it was still a British Empire to have an order of. But thank you very much, Sarah, for those extremely generous words. And it's a real pleasure and an honour for me to be taking part in any EMET event. I have such admiration for the work you do, which I think, you know, all of us, wherever we may be, should support what you do for the United States of America and, of course, for Israel and the civilized world. So a great privilege for me. I thought, well, before I actually start into the meat of this topic, and I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes. I love the sound of my own voice, so I'm sure someone can flash me a message if I go on too long. I thought I'd just mention a bit about coronavirus, because I know no one really hears much about it. It's not really on the news very often. But over here in Britain, where I'm speaking from, we've past the worst, I think, at least of this stage of the infection. And the peak was reached, I think, a week or 10 days ago. And we're now experiencing, thankfully, fewer deaths than we have been in the past and fewer infections. But of course, we're still in a form of lockdown. We had a pretty severe lockdown until about a week ago, and now it's slightly relaxed. Everyone's got to stay in their house pretty much unless they're going out doing exercise or going to shops, or those people that can't work from home go to work. But it has been relaxed a bit more now. So, for example, I live near the beach, and on the beach there's quite a few people walking up and down, even some sunbathing, etc., which we haven't seen for a while. Even we don't get a lot of sun over here in the UK, but we've had some. The sun has certainly shined on us during this coronavirus episode. Just touching on Israel, I keep in close touch with many people in Israel. I was speaking to a general this morning, IDF general, and I've spoken to many other people in Israel in the last few days. And I'm sure you all know better than I do that Israel has relaxed its measures against coronavirus because they've been so successful in countering it. But you wouldn't know that really if you were over here in Britain, because although Israel's, I think, one of the most successful countries in the world at dealing with coronavirus, while other examples of effective measures are given on our news, Israel is never mentioned. We hear about Singapore, we hear about Hong Kong, we hear about other places like that, but Israel, no, because it's verboten to to say anything that's positive about Israel if it can be avoided. So we don't hear much about it, but they have been doing very well, I think, despite the fact they've had some tragic deaths and illnesses. And one thing that we do hear about over here is how Israel is badly treating the Palestinian people in the West Bank and in Gaza, and how they're in some ways frustrating their efforts to contain coronavirus in those areas. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. The extent of Israeli cooperation with the local populations, Arab populations living in Israel proper, Arabs in the West Bank, Arabs in Gaza, the extent of that cooperation is, I think, extremely impressive, and I'm sure many of you are well aware of what's been going on. But one thing I would say is that it's not new and it's not a surprise. This happened before, nearly 100 years ago, in 1920 to 30, back in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, before the recreation of the State of Israel. And there was a gentleman by the name of Israel Kliegler, who was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and was educated in the United States of America in New York. And he made aliyah to the Palestinian mandate back in 1920. And he was a virologist, a microbiologist, who is largely responsible for eradicating malaria from that land. It didn't get, he died in 1944 before the State of Israel was recreated. And it wasn't completely eradicated by the time he died, but he certainly made massive inroads into it, dealing with this, not the same kind of thing, but a similar circumstance to what we have today, except then Arab and Jewish populations, every other type of person in Palestine was suffered enormously from malaria, and many deaths occurred. And it was, there were many Zionists who went over there who decided to leave the country because of malaria, and Arab families were dying left, right, and centre because of malaria. And this had been going on for centuries. Well, Israel Kliegler, a very prominent, strong Zionist, worked out a way of eradicating it. And in order to do so, he knew that he had to get the cooperation of the Arabs as well as the Jews, and he succeeded in doing that. Great effect, despite the efforts of President Abbas and Hamas's forebears, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was the Arab leader at the time in that land, who, as most people know, I'm sure, spent the war in Nazi Germany, cavorting with the likes of Hitler, Himmler, and the SS officers, doing his best to persuade them, if they could, to bring the Holocaust across to the Middle East. But he, back in the 1920s, he did everything he could to prevent this cooperation on malaria, which was saving the lives of his own people. And that included violence against his own population. But it didn't work. The cooperation continued, and malaria was eventually eradicated. And today we see remarkable things like, for example, IDF soldiers going into Arab villages in Israel proper and also in the West Bank to help them deal with COVID. And we've even seen things like Arab leaders, community leaders in these villages, putting on IDF marked vests to show their official role in this practice, which is something that is, I think, almost unheard of, totally unheard of. Because formerly, when they went into these places, they would be greeted with hostility at best. So, and the efforts that the IDF has gone to help the Palestinian communities, including in Gaza, and they've done everything they can to facilitate aid getting through into Gaza, and provided a great deal of aid themselves as well. And I think that sort of brings me on to the first point I want to speak about, which is the morality of the IDF. And I'm sure I don't need to persuade anyone that's listening here about that. I'm sure you know it only too well, and I'm sure in many cases your sons, daughters, yourselves even, and other family members have served in the IDF, perhaps as lone soldiers. And the IDF, I mean, I've been associated with the IDF for many years now, and I've worked very closely with I've witnessed combat between the IDF and terrorists in Gaza in particular. And I can personally say without fear or hesitation of any sort that there is no army in the world that take such great efforts and so many pains to preserve the lives of innocent civilians among their enemy populations as the IDF do. And it's not just me saying that. I was over in Israel a couple of years ago with a group of around 12, 13 generals, retired generals from around the world, who were doing a study into the conflict in Gaza. And they came to the same conclusion. Many of them had never been to Israel before. They had no particular affinity with Israel in virtually all cases. But they came to the conclusion that I came to. And that when we came to write our report, which is available online, it's at the Friends of Israel initiative, on the website, Friends of Israel. The main concern, believe it or not, of these generals, and there were generals from Britain, America, Canada, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, other countries in different places in the world, Australia even. And their main concern was that their own armies would not be able to achieve the standards the IDF had achieved in humanitarian work with the civilian populations. And they felt that Israel was setting the bar so high that it could potentially cause them problems. And also General Dempsey, who of course was the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff until a couple of years ago, he sent a team of his officers after one of the Gaza conflicts to examine the way the IDF operated, and he also came to the same conclusion. So it's not just me, it's not just a handful of other people who do have an affinity for Israel, as I do. I'm not in the pay of Israel, unfortunately. I'm not Jewish, but I do know a lot about it, and I'm able to apply my military expertise gained in fighting terrorism around the world over many years, 30 years. I'm able to apply that to these circumstances. I can see what other people who don't have military experience often cannot see. And of course, those people who could be impartial are heavily influenced by organizations like the BBC and other Western media, which is determined always to paint Israel in the blackest possible light. And they succeed in doing it. But it's not just that they're wrong when they say that Israel, carries out war crimes. They're 100% wrong. They're 180 degrees wrong. They couldn't be more wrong if they tried. And I've had these discussions with journalists in Israel, journalists in England, and it's almost impossible to penetrate through. Not every case. There are some who will listen to reason, but it's almost impossible to penetrate through the agenda that their editorial directors impose upon them. And of course, many of them are on the left and follow what in Britain anyway is a sort of left-wing anti-Israel agenda, which was led, of course, by the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, who fortunately is no longer, he's not dead, but he's no longer leader of the opposition. But he was, as I'm sure you are familiar with his name, he was a notorious anti-Semite, and his party is riddled with anti-Semitism, and it is still today. They deny it, they refuse to accept it, they pretend they're changed, they haven't. I hope they will do, because their leader at present, I think, would probably like them to, even though he was a senior member of Corbyn's shadow cabinet. But anyway, we can only hope that will happen. But anyway, it's amazing, amazingly the opposite of what we're led to believe. And I think one thing that I believe is that the government in Britain, the Foreign Office in Britain, and the media in Britain have failed to keep up with the change of mood in the Middle East. And I think most of us know that across the Middle East, Arab governments are changing their stance. And countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, Bahrain, many of these countries, they want to be close to Israel. In some cases, they are close to Israel, but it's under the radar. And I was in Saudi Arabia myself only a few months ago, maybe a year ago now. And I had meetings with members of the government there who told me privately that they want close relations, and they would like to be able to, openly recognize the state of Israel. But they claim that their people are so anti-Israel Israel that it wouldn't be possible. And of course, I did point out to them something they probably already knew, and I'm sure everybody listening here today knows, that the main reason for that populations of Arab countries are opposed to Israel and to Jews is because of the indoctrination they've received over many, many decades, almost throughout the Middle East. And just to give you an example of the effects of indoctrination from my own experience, it's not directly related, well, it is sort of related to Israel. But when I was in the first Gulf War, I was in a tank in the first Gulf War as a captain in 1991, and we invaded Iraq through Saudi Arabia after Iraq had illegally occupied Kuwait. And the Iraqis were falling over themselves to surrender. They couldn't surrender quick enough. And we were driving through the desert one morning, and there was a great column of Iraqis flooding across the desert. And I stopped the tank, got out of the tank, went and spoke to their leader, who was also a captain, I think, who was quite a young guy, and he spoke English. And he said, I want to surrender. And I said, well, I can't take your surrender because I'm attacking. So I can't take your surrender. But if you carry on going south, I will arrange for some other British troops to come and meet you and capture you. And he seemed very relieved by that. And he said, before you go, I'd like to ask you one question. I said, what's that? He said, why are you flying these Union Jacks from your tank? And I said, well, it's mainly so the Americans don't attack us from the air, so they recognize us being friends. And he said, yes, but why have you got British flags? I said, because we're British. He said, no, you're not British. I said, we're speaking English. That's the British flag. I am British. What can I tell you? And he wouldn't have it, would insist that we weren't. I said, so who do you think we are? He said, you're Israelis. And why were we Israeli? Because these Iraqis, they've been picked up from one piece of desert and they were taken to another piece of desert to invade Kuwait. And they were not told they're invading Kuwait because, there might not have been as much motivation for them invading their Arab brothers. They were told they were invading Israel, so they thought they were in Israel. And that to me, that indicates the extent of indoctrination that a national army would con its people into thinking they're invading a completely different country because they know that will motivate them. If it's Israel, it will motivate them to fight harder. He was very relieved also when he believed me, because he thought before he was going to be surrendering to Israelis, and he definitely didn't want to surrender to Israelis, again, because of the indoctrination. Of course, they'd have been treated properly as prisoners of war, but they didn't think that would be the case. So I thought I'd just mention that as an example of the level of indoctrination that exists throughout the Arab world. I think but it is certainly true that because of the threat that Iran poses to not just to the Middle East, but certainly to every Sunni Arab country in the Middle East, as well as Israel and the rest of the Western world, it's one of the main motivators on the part of the Arabs for wanting to be closer to Israel, because they see a threat to them, and they know that Israel is a very effective fighting organization, which doesn't just have the capability, but also has the will to resist Iran. And while we're on the subject of Iran, before I move on to a different subject, I'm sure everyone here is well aware of the threat that Iran poses. It's developed a slightly different form in recent days or recent weeks, whereby Israel and Iran are currently involved in a cyber war. Yes, of course, there have been cyber wars going on before, and we've had, for example, the Iranian nuclear program was undermined by an Israeli and American cyber attack. But now we've seen something that's a bit different. It hasn't really been seen before like this, which was a few weeks ago, the Iranians carried out a series of cyber attacks against Israeli water facilities, sewage treatment and water flow facilities, which fortunately, because Israel is well ahead of Iran in terms of cyber operations, it didn't do a great deal of damage. Israel was able to prevent it. But then carried out a retaliation earlier this month, and they brought to a cyber attack a significant Iranian port in Bandar Abbas by attacking the traffic control systems in the port, which meant that ships couldn't come and go as normal. even the ground traffic couldn't come and go as normal, and it caused massive problems for that port. Almost brought the port to a halt, I think, and it's still got big problems because although Israel was able to prevent severe damage from the Iranian cyber attacks, Iran wasn't able to really deal with what Israel threw at them. Although Israel has not acknowledged that it was responsible for that, because of course, if they openly and publicly admitted to having damaged the Iranian regime like that, then it would have resulted in further retaliation from Iran, who would feel obliged to salvage their honor. Of course, the Iranian government is already under enormous stress from their own population for a number of reasons, which we could cover in Q&A if you want to do so. I'm conscious I've been taking up a lot of your time, so I'll just touch on a couple of other issues now. The first one is the International Criminal Court, and it goes back to what I mentioned before about the opposition to Israel in the West. The International Criminal Court is a political body. It's supposed to be a legal body. It's supposed to be a court. It's supposed to be a criminal court that deals with crimes, war crimes carried out by countries that are unable to deal with offenders themselves or unwilling to do so. And it's had a few relatively successful prosecutions involving the Balkans and involving African countries. But of course, now it's turned its attention on Israel. It has wanted to do that for a long, long time. It has Israel firmly in its sights. It also has America in its sights, and it's investigating alleged American war crimes in Iraq. It has Britain in its sights. It's investigating alleged British war crimes in Afghanistan. That may be the other way around, actually. America's being investigated for Afghanistan and Britain for Iraq. But nevertheless, it's the three usual suspects, the great Satan, the US, and the two little Satans, Britain and Israel, who are in the crosshairs of the International Criminal Court. Well, Britain is foolish enough to be a member and to have signed up to the ICC, which many of us, when it happened back in, I think it was 2003, were pretty outspoken about what a mistake this would be to join the ICC, because if you can imagine the spectacle of British soldiers being dragged into The Hague accused of war crimes. And America had the sense, the United States had the great sense not to sign up to the ICC, as did Israel. But neither of those facts have stopped the ICC from focusing on those two countries as well as Britain. Of course, Israel, Britain, America, we all have proven, long-established, world-respected legal systems that deal with soldiers who do carry out war crimes. And yes, with the best army in the world, you do get soldiers who do stupid things or are malign or do the wrong thing or whatever. That does happen. And when it happens, we deal with it ourselves. We don't need a kangaroo court in The Hague to bring us to justice, and neither does Israel. And there's so many reasons why the ICC has distorted itself. It's distorted its own mandate and its own jurisdiction out of all recognition in order to force Israel into the dock. And just a couple of examples, there's many other things I could tell you about it, but a couple of examples as to why this is a distortion of reality is that, first of all, the Palestinian Authority, who have been responsible for bringing these allegations to the ICC, they're not a state. They don't qualify as a state under any terms of the word, yet they're treated by the ICC on a unilateral decision as a state. And therefore, they've accepted these allegations, and they've decided to try or to investigate at least Israel. And the second issue is that one of the allegations made against Israel is the war crimes, alleged war crimes in Gaza, and I've already spoken about that. They did not happen. What they're being accused of did not happen. I can say that absolutely as a fact. And one of the other allegations is again, that Israel's broken the Geneva Convention by illegally settling people in Judea and Samaria. Well, you don't need me to tell you that the settlement of Jews in Judea and Samaria can by nobody be considered to be illegal, not by anybody who's got an ounce of either brain power or morality. But apart from that, for the Palestinians to bring charges, or the ICC to bring charges against Israel in occupied territory, that territory has got to be occupied territory, illegally occupied territory. Well, it can't be, because the territory is, yes, it's disputed, But where are the borders? Where are the boundaries? Where are the agreed lines between Israel and the Palestinian Authority's territory? There's been no decision taken, and the chief prosecutor of the court, Bensouda, she recognised that she's on very shaky grounds, and has therefore referred her decision on jurisdiction of the court, territorial jurisdiction, to a pre-trial chamber, and we're now waiting for the pre-trial chamber's decision, which I think will be taken sometime in the next few weeks. And I should point out that many countries around the world, I'm afraid to say not including Britain, but many countries around the world have lodged strong protests with the ICC against this prosecution of Israel, and that includes Germany, and it includes Australia and other countries. I think about 9 countries who are members of the ICC objected to what's going on, which is unprecedented. The United States of America, I'm very happy to know and to note, that has banned Bensouda, the prosecutor, from coming to America. They've revoked her visa. And they're also planning, or thinking about, at least, depending on what the ICC does, both to America and to Israel, about imposing other sanctions on the ICC. And I'm wholeheartedly in favour of that. And I would very much like it if I could persuade Britain to join forces with the United States on this issue, but I fear it's not probably going to happen. It is a very serious matter. I think it's one of Israel's #1 concerns at the moment, because, of course, if the investigation goes on, the International Criminal Court is allowed to summons any individual from Israel that it thinks it would be required as a witness or under accusation to give evidence. And if they don't do so, they can be arrested by international arrest warrant. And that, of course, means that many politicians and military people, serving and retired, could be subject to arrest if they travelled outside Israel into countries that recognised these arrest warrants. That's not the only problem, of course, but that's one of the main problems why it has to be stopped. And I would certainly hope that if this pre-trial chamber decides on bringing an investigation, I certainly hope that the United States of America takes the strongest possible action against the ICC, which they have said that they will. The final point to make refers to what people laughingly call annexation of areas of Judea and Samaria. Of course, it isn't annexation. It's described as annexation by people who are opposed to it, but it isn't annexation, because annexation can only apply to territory that is somebody else's sovereign territory. You can seize it by annexation, which is illegal. But that territory is not anyone's sovereign territory. If it's anyone's sovereign territory, it's certainly Israel's sovereign territory. And so, but in other arguments, it's disputed territory, and there are obviously issues to be resolved there, but it is not annexation. And I think that there's a lot of misinformation about this issue, and a lot of misunderstanding. In effect, the idea, the intention under the President Trump peace proposals is that Israel will reassert its sovereignty, reestablish its sovereignty over areas of the West Bank that are predominantly occupied by Jews, not by Arabs. There are some Arabs living there, but not many. And they're all areas that, under every single previous consideration of a peace agreement, always been considered would revert to Israel in any kind of a deal. And the other area is the Jordan Valley, and the Jordan Valley is an essential piece of geography that Israel must control in order to defend its country. And again, there's virtually no Arabs living in the Jordan Valley. It's very, very sparsely populated. Of course, the Palestinians utterly reject this idea. Arab governments have given, as part of President Trump's peace proposals, the Arab governments have given a relatively good support for it. That, we've had mixed messages, but generally speaking, they are, I think, supportive of it, in line with what I said before about the change in attitude of Arab governments. Jordan is rattling sabers, as you'd expect, but Jordan depends on Israel securing the Jordan Valley. It depends on a great deal of other support for its own security, as well as water resources and so on, gas from Israel. and so it is saber rattling. And I think, yeah, if the extension of sovereignty does occur, then I'm sure Jordan will be making statements, maybe withdrawing their embassy, bringing their ambassador back, things like that, possibly reneging on some trade deals and things. But that's all it will be. And no doubt the Palestinian leadership will do their best to incite more violence in Judea and Samaria and from Gaza. But again, it's something that it'll hurt for a bit, but I think it will pass. And I think it's, in my humble opinion, and I wouldn't dream of giving any advice to the government of Israel, even if they listen to it, but in my humble opinion, what Israel is proposing to do in July, or not before the 1st of July, is a vital measure for its future, for its strategy, for its protection. And also, in my opinion, it does present, as part of the President Trump peace package, does present what is probably the greatest opportunity there has ever been so far for some kind of peace deal, because it puts pressure on the Palestinians that so far they haven't had. They've never been put in this position before. They've always had the whip hand. It's always been Israel that's required to make concessions. Well, under the current US administration, that has changed. And all I can say is, long may that change continue. I don't know for sure, and I don't suppose anybody does, possibly not even Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, know whether this sovereignty will be reasserted. I think there's still a question about that. They still haven't finally concluded the actual specific definition of the areas. And there is negotiation, I think, to be done with some of the Arabs as well. But it's the certainty is it won't happen before the 1st of July. It might well happen sometime after the 1st of July. Well, Sarah, I apologise, because I said I'd speak for 20 minutes and I've spoken for about 25 minutes. So I do apologise. I did warn you and you could have told me to shut up, but I'm very happy to take the question.
No need to apologize. We could listen to you for hours, really. So many questions popped up as you were speaking. The first question that comes to mind is, in your study of history, and I know you're a student of history, are you aware of any other nation who has conquered territory in defensive wars or offensive wars, and then was sued for the return of that territory? Is there any precedent in history that you're aware of?
There are plenty of precedents for the contrary, and the main charge, shall we say, against Israel is this issue of settling Jews in Judea and Samaria, and that is the only time. This is the only time that particular clause of the Geneva, I think it's the 5th Geneva Convention. It's the only time that clause has been used against any country in the world. The ICC over northern Cyprus, which, as you know, is illegally occupied by Turkey, areas in Eastern Europe illegally occupied by Russia. The ICC made explicit decisions not to bring this charge against them, or any other charge for that matter. So there is no other case, there's no other situation, anything like it. It is only because it's the Jewish state.
Thank you. One other question, quick question I have, not so easy though. You mentioned Iran and the population of Iran being very restive. What would it take? I know regime change has become a dirty word, or dirty 2 words in foreign policy circles in the United States, but what would it take to overthrow the regime in Iran?
Well, Iran's #1 concern today is the stability of its regime. It was its #1 concern before coronavirus broke out in such a big way in Iran. And I'm sure everyone is aware that there were large-scale street protests going on for a long, long time in Iran. There were a lot of it was economical. Unrest because of Iran's mismanagement of its economy, and because the people knew that Iran was actually spending millions and millions of dollars on its expansionist work in places like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, and elsewhere. And that caused a lot of dissatisfaction because people were feeling that people were hurting. And when Soleimani was killed, quite rightly, by the United States by the United States Air Force, when he was killed, we were treated here in Britain to footage, extensive, almost endless extensive footage of his funerals that were held to commemorate him. Thousands and thousands of people. And it was almost like a state funeral here in Britain. It was given so much coverage. But what that didn't reveal is that actually Soleimani's death was welcomed by very, very many Iranians, because they knew that he was behind this disastrous policy of spending Iranian resources in countries like Syria and Lebanon and so on. And then that was compounded by, and the regime was seen as weak then. It was a weak point in the regime, which I think gave people a bit more incentive as well. And that was compounded by the shooting down of the airliner over Tehran, which the Iranian people did not like at all. They really held the government responsible for that. And then we've added, on top of that, we've got the mishandling in Iran of coronavirus, which has caused even further dissatisfaction. So the regime is worried about its stability. In my opinion, the only real way to bring down that regime is from within. I don't think it's a realistic probability to expect any country outside Iran to bring down that regime, unless it triggered by a Iranian offensive action, large-scale, significant offensive action. But the only I believe, and I wouldn't class myself as a particular expert on Iran, but I do understand a lot about Iran. I believe that the only likely way that regime will be brought down is by government elements bringing it down. And by that, I really mean some element, some part of the military, the armed forces, bringing down the government. And if that happens, then of course they're extremely vulnerable. I think they can probably withstand large-scale mass protests. And of course, the Iranian people only want to go so far in this protest, because they just have to look across at what's been going on in Syria when they attempted to bring down their government and to establish some kind of independence in certain parts of Syria, and the huge numbers of people that died as a result. And of course, they don't want to impose that upon their own people in Iran.
Right. We in America stared down the evil empire of Russia, and part of the way we did it was by working with the native dissident population, the Jewish population, and hopefully we could take note from that by working with the dissident population in Iran that is really suffocating under the theocratic chokehold. And let's hope we live to see the day. So now I am going to turn the floor over to our wonderful Director of Communications, who's incredibly competent and with whom I cannot live. And she will read the questions that have come in. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much, Colonel, for taking the time to join us today on the webinar. So we have had a number of questions, and just a note to the audience that unfortunately we won't be able to get through all of them, but we'll do the best that we can. So the first question that we have, do you think that there is any hope for the new leadership of the Labour Party to put their history of anti-Semitism behind them?
Well, you make life very easy because you're both called Sarah, so I don't have to remember your name. It's fantastic. I think, I mean, I touched on this before. I'll talk a little bit more about it. The new leader of the Labour Party is Sir Keir Starmer, who was the Brexit shadow minister under Jeremy Corbyn, a senior minister in his government. And we didn't hear anything from Sir Keir Starmer about anti-Semitism when he was a leading member of a, not government, but shadow government, a leading member of a shadow government that was responsible for anti-Semitism. We didn't hear protests from him, and I consider he therefore very much lacks credibility because of that. And I would apply that, it's not a personal thing with him, I would apply that to anyone else who was a member of that party or that government who didn't do anything about it. There were some very brave and courageous and morally upstanding Labour Party MPs who resigned from the party because of it, but he wasn't one of them. So that has to cast doubt over him. But also he's got a big problem on his hands, because first of all he's got to bring the Labour Party back from the abyss. The last election over here in Britain in December dealt the biggest blow that the Labour Party has ever had to it. And many constituencies here in the UK that had never before voted Conservative, that had always been Labour, voted Conservative. And there was what was called a red wall. When we have it the other way around from you, red is Labour and blue is Conservative over here. It's the opposite, I know, to you. But there was a red wall up in the north of England, which was solid Labour, and it's been breached. Most of it now Conservative, or a large amount of it. So he's got to recover from that. That's a big problem for him. And he's got a relatively small number of MPs in Parliament, and can have limited impact, I think, with that difference in the balance of the parties, limited impact in Parliament at all. The anti-Semitism problem is on top of that, really. And although I think it was a significant aspect of Corbyn's defeat, because it was quite big news over here, the anti-Semitic aspect of Corbyn's agenda. But it is ingrained in the party. It's institutionalized in the Labour Party. I don't say every member of the Labour Party is anti-Semitic, of course they're not, but it is nevertheless ingrained. And this party has been the first political party in the UK that's been subject to a specific independent investigation of anti-Semitism, of racism in effect. Anyway, one of the problems they have, one of the main reasons that anti-Semitism took such a strong grip in the Labour Party is because Labour were very, very keen to harness as much of the immigrant population in Britain as they possibly could, including several generations downstream of immigration. And they clearly decided, at some stage, they clearly decided that the way to get, for example, the Muslim vote in Britain was to oppose Israel, was to be anti-Israel. And they were staunchly anti-Israel. I've no doubt if Corbyn had been Prime Minister instead of Boris Johnson, that his first act would have been to break off diplomatic relations with Israel and recognise the state of Palestine. I've no doubt about that at all. And there is obviously intrinsic anti-Jew hate in elements of the Labour Party, but I think a stronger stream is this business of trying to appease the Muslim population. And I don't say again that all Muslims are anti-Semitic, and I don't say that all Muslims hate Israel, but I do know that, because I've spoken to so many, I do know that it's a big thing among their population. And that's why Corbyn will struggle, Keir Starmer, I think, will struggle to hold the party together, to retain the support he's got, and to cleanse the party of anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much. The next question we have, do you feel that there's any danger in accepting the Trump deal in terms of the eventual existence of a legitimate Palestinian state and what that relationship would look like with Israel, and whether or not there's any fears of security risks?
I mean, part of the Trump proposals specify that it has to be a demilitarized state. So it's going to depend effectively on Israeli security to enable it to exist. And I think that's a significant issue, which is quite right, again, in my opinion. The problem is, if Israel did not retain its presence on the Jordan Valley and its presence in at least certain areas of Judea and Samaria, and possibly larger areas than it is planning to bring into sovereignty, that state, even if it had its own security apparatus, even if it wasn't demilitarized, and it will of course have policing functions, etc., but not armed forces, even if it wasn't demilitarized, it would not be able to control that territory if other bad actors like the Iranians or the Islamic State or its successors decided to use the Palestinian areas as a base to attack Israel from. So Israel has to maintain security capability and security control over those areas, come what may. And I think that goes right the way forward. Even if there is a Palestinian state, it will still apply for the lifetime of that state, as far as I can see. So I think, you know, the security issues, in my opinion, will be no greater than they are today, and possibly less great. But in terms of whether or not that it's a likely thing to happen, I have grave doubts that the Palestinian leadership will go along with any deal, any proposal which results in them having to recognize a Jewish state. They don't want a Jewish state in that land. They want only one thing. And I'm talking about the leaders here, not every Palestinian, but they want the land not to be controlled by anyone who is not Muslim. They will not accept a Jewish state. And it's a really real tragedy, because, and I hope to be wrong on that. I hope I am wrong, but I'm not so sure I am when you look at the number of times that the Palestinian leadership has rejected even the most generous offers over the years since back in the 1930s to have their own state. But it's a real tragedy, because you know, I'm sure most people here, if not everybody's been to Israel, and we know what a prosperous, flourishing, innovative, dynamic, secure country Israel is, as probably as much in any of those areas as any other country in the world, and more than most, more than many. And the Israelis will not be the ones that suffer as a result of this. They won't be. They're not now. They won't be in the future. Yes, there's suffering as a result of this situation. We tragically saw a young Israeli soldier killed by a rock thrown. We've seen Israelis killed in Gaza and elsewhere, and in Judea and Samaria as well. And of course, the people of Sderot and other villages and towns around the Gaza border suffer frequently from having to be subjected to missile fire from out of Gaza. So yes, people are suffering, but it is not an existential threat. For the Palestinians, it really is much worse than that. They are living, in many cases, they're living very miserable lives. They lack the prosperity they could have. They lack the freedom they could have. They lack the opportunities they could have. And the reason for that is because they are governed, both in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria, they are governed by kleptocratic leaders who have taken international aid and put it in their own pockets and used large quantities of other international aid to create weapons against Israel and to pay for terrorists who carry out attacks against the Jews. And they are intent on perpetrating this conflict, or perpetuating this conflict. So I think, you know, in many ways, I feel saddest, I think, for the Palestinian Arabs, because they are the ones who are suffering now. And while their leadership continues to act in the way they're acting, they will be suffering in the future. And that's despite the huge number of things that Israel does to help them. And we don't want to go into detail now, but Israel just granted something, I think it was something like $300 million to help the Palestinian, as a loan to help the Palestinian, it may have been 30 million, I can't remember, I'm not too good at figures, whatever it was, to help the Palestinians counter coronavirus. So it won't be because of Israel, it'll be because these leaders, who the Palestinian people do not deserve, because certainly most of the ones that I speak to, they want what you and I want. They want prosperity, freedom. They want opportunities for their children in the future. And they're not getting it because of this. And I think that the Arab countries around the Middle East, that's one reason why they are more now looking towards Israel and getting increasingly irritated and annoyed by the Palestinian leadership, because they also recognize that their fellow Arabs are being effectively betrayed by their own leaders.
Thank you so much. The next question we have, are there any significant changes that we can expect from the new UK government in relation to Israel, perhaps initiating positive PR and confronting the current media bias against Israel?
Well, I'm very happy to say that all of the best prime ministers in this country that we've had have been strongly supporting Israel and Zionism. And we go back to David Lloyd George, the prime minister in the First World War, who was responsible for the Balfour Declaration, which was a key milestone in the recreation of the state of Israel. And David Lloyd George was a fervent Zionist. He praised Zionism, and he saw a great future for the Jewish state when eventually it would be created. And the same goes for Winston Churchill, very strong supporter of Zionism and then of Israel. And Margaret Thatcher, without a question of a doubt, Margaret Thatcher was a strong Zionist and pro-Israeli. Tony Blair as well, and our current David Cameron also, and our current Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who is strongly pro-Israel. As to changes in British attitudes towards Israel, I think the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, is in a way stuck in a past. That we often refer, some of us who are being less respectful than we should to the Foreign Office. Many of them are often referred to as the Camel Corps, because they kind of instinctively side with the Arabs over Israel, and it's partly due to economic reasons, to the oil and to the desire to appease the Arab countries. But as I mentioned, they've been left behind a little bit because Arab countries' attitudes to Israel are changing, and the way to appease them is not to oppose Israel, in fact, quite the opposite. And hopefully that message will filter through eventually to the Foreign Office when they get off their camels and live in the real world. And I don't condemn the whole Foreign Office, because I know many people who work in the Foreign Office. I've worked very closely with the Foreign Office myself, but there is still a strong contingent that really doesn't get it. The EU is another problem. The EU is strongly opposed to Israel, and I don't mean every country, every person, but as an institution, they're strongly, particularly the Western part of the EU, is strongly opposed to Israel. We've seen that in their reaction to the proposals to reassert sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. I think when Britain leaves the EU, Israel will have lost one of its strongest allies. Well, when I say when we leave, we have left the EU. Now that we've left the EU, Israel has lost one of its strongest allies in the EU, which has been a voice of moderation and influence against the EU's anti-Israel approach. That may be a bit of a problem. It won't change. It won't change anything significantly, but it's a disadvantage, I think, of us leaving the EU. But an advantage of us leaving the EU, I hope and I think, once we've finalised our exit and finalised the trade deals that we're going to be doing and our relationship with the EU in the future, I very much hope that it will free Britain to go out on its own in many different areas, and including its relationship with Israel, because that has been constrained by the need to try and maintain some kind of orderly relationship with the EU over these sort of issues.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question at this time. One of our viewers was wondering about your perspective on the word annexation in this context versus extending sovereignty, and whether or not there's an important distinction there that you would know of.
I did mention this briefly earlier. I'll just reiterate what I said, really, which is that annexation, under the definition of annexation in international law, is effectively the seizure and the extension of one country into another country. For example, the annexation of Austria by the Germans back in the 1930s. And there have been other examples of annexation taking place around the world. But this cannot be annexation. It cannot be annexation because the territory that we're talking about is no one else's sovereign territory. The only country that actually really does have a legal right to that territory is Israel. And that legal right was granted a long time ago, back in 1920, in the San Remo resolution, which became part of the League of Nations, and then later was incorporated into the United Nations Charter when the United Nations was formed, which essentially gave Israel sovereignty over the entire area from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. And that has never been changed. It's often ignored because it's a very inconvenient fact, but it's never been changed. And so I think that you know, however you distort it and whatever you claim, whatever you say, Israel is not illegally occupying that territory. There are not illegal settlements there. Yes, parts of that area, maybe even the whole area, is disputed. But there's a big difference between a dispute over territory, which there are many, many around the world, which most people tend to ignore or never heard of, and the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians. And why is that such a big difference? Because it's been the subject of what has been the greatest slur campaign against any country that's ever existed in the world, which is a long-standing anti-Israel propaganda campaign.
Okay.
Thank you so much, and welcome back, Sarah.
A little glitch that my computer went dead for a moment. So, okay.
We need to see you again.
Okay, sorry.
I think that was all the time we had for questions. Sarah, if you would like to close.
Yes, I cannot thank you enough, Richard, for your years and years of unquestionable support and friendship for Western civilization against the radical Islamic forces in this world. And I know whether or not we're battling the coronavirus as we are right now, or other temporary crises that emerge, our enemies are tenacious and they don't lose sight of their major objective. Many of us in the West get lulled to sleep and distracted, but you never have. And thank you so much. It is really an honor and a privilege to be able to call you a friend, not only of Israel and the United States, but also personally. And let's stay tuned, because we have some other wonderful webinars coming up shortly that I don't want to announce until they're confirmed, but very few people could ever top the intellectual honesty and moral integrity of Colonel Richard Kemp. Thank you so much for tuning in today.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's been a great pleasure, and I wish all of your viewers well in this very difficult time that we seem to be finding ourselves. We will no doubt come out of it all soon. Let's hope.
Let's hope. Thank you so much. Be well. Bye-bye.